The talk tonight is going to be divided in certain few parts. I want to make sure you to know how long it will take and what we'll do. It's about 45 minutes, and then we're going to have a few questions and answers. First, I'm going to tell you what it's about, then my credential for speaking about it, then why it's critical today to both readers and writers to know the stuff I'm talking about. Then I'm going to go into techniques, because fiction has techniques supposed to do some things, and we'll talk about these things too. Finally, I'm going to give some source books for those who are interested, and plus exercises. Writers are performers, and most performers do exercises. When you mention to writers to do exercise, they all get offended. But people who play violins, or ballet dancers, or gymnasts, or magicians, anybody else with a performance artist usually does exercise, or etude as they call them, to practice the basics. Many writers don't think there are basics. Well, there are. We'll speak about that. So my talk tonight is about making literature. And I am going to focus on the word literature. Literature is art. First thing is what you want to do. You want to create literature which is written art that lasts. What is art? Of all the definitions, I prefer the simplest. Literature, like all art, is a living thing. Therefore, it doesn't have to do anything besides survive. Literature, like every living thing, wants to survive. And to survive, it has to stick itself into a human brain. Otherwise, it's just a piece of notes on a paper someplace in the forest, nobody sees. So to stick itself into the human brain, it has to do two things and two only. When you pick up the work, the book, the story, you cannot stop reading. The second thing, once you finish reading, you cannot possibly forget it ever. That's it. Once you've done that, and it lasts, it is literature, in my definition. Therefore, Tristram Shandy, which some of you may have read, against Dr. Johnson's advice, Dr. Johnson said it will never last. It did last. It's a strange thing, but 300 years, and it still lasted. And a very famous writer at the time called Elinor Glyn, who wrote the first sort of semi-pornographic Harlequin romances of the 19th century, she didn't last. But Evelyn Waugh wrote a little doggerel about her, little limerick, and really a doggerel. And this did last. Does anybody know it? It goes like this. Would you like to sin with Elinor Glyn on the tiger skin? Or would you prefer to err with her on some other fur? This thing lasted. It is literature. Elinor Glyn wrote some wonderful books. Some of them really good. Something called The Man and His Maid. It's just very moving. It didn't last because it didn't have something. That something is what we are trying to catch. Can you catch it? I went through a 2-year program of creative writing. I've done many other things in writing, and most writers think, no, it's ineffable. It is not ineffable. When I was in creative writing program at San Francisco State University, most teachers would get hives if I would ask them about technique. They would say craft. It's something which is more sort of airy-fairy. Nothing specific, not like making furniture. But it is like making furniture. There are things you can do specifically, and if you know how to do them, you cannot possibly avoid making something that, if not last, at least catches the reader's attention. So, why do I say catch the reader's attention? Most people who start writing from themselves. They have something to say. So they sit down, I have something to tell you. And the reader maybe sits, maybe doesn't sit. That's not the way things usually work. You start with the reader's brain. The one thing every writer should have to be a writer is to have a reader. So the first question is, how do you capture the reader's attention? What is human attention captured by? So before we start looking at the language, we have to start with the human side. What is it that makes people catch attention? Now, here I'm going to get a little diversion and speak about my credential about speaking about literature. I have had 2 story collections published, and they won all kinds of awards, and they made no money at all, but one of my stories got into the Best American Short Stories in 1995. The same story got into the Pushcart Prize collection. It got into the Journey Prize in Canada. It Another story won a medal, Sophie Brody medal in the US. One of them was made into a play by the Berkeley Theater. And other awards have been won by yours truly. A novel of mine, which has been in the works for a number of years, is going to be published next year. In other words, what I am writing is not schlock. It is certified literature for whatever that is. At least it doesn't make any money, but it is being studied in creative writing programs, and it is kind of lasting. Now, I'm going to go to some techniques later on, but again, I'm going to start from the human animal. How do human readers get their attention captured? Well, the first obligation of every writer is to capture the attention of the reader. The reader gets his input physically from four sources. You have visual, you have auditory, you have salivary, which is in medical both the taste and the smell together, and you have the tactile. I'm going to speak about three kinds of language, because purposeful language, aside from chit-chat, is divided into three parts. There is hypnotic language, the fictional language, supposed to raise emotions, informative language, supposed to convey information, and there's rhetorical language that's supposed to cause people to act. These three types of language are structured differently, and they're supposed to create different physical reactions in the body. Physical. When you want to create emotion, you are operating on the limbic system, all these hormones and liquid slosh inside the body. When you want to create action, you want to make the reader, the viewer or the listener or the reader act using rhetorical language. That's what Barack Obama is using. There's a variety of rhetoric. There's the Greek rhetoric, Roman rhetoric, German rhetoric, French rhetoric, so-called Cartesian rhetoric. If you use it correctly, you can generate action, no matter the content. Finally, there's also the informational language. You want to convey people certain amount of information that will change the structure of the neurons in the brain. These are three different parts of the body. Neurons, you change them physically somehow via words. You convey information. You move the muscles somehow by action. You create action. And you somehow agitate the reader. You create emotions. How do you do it via language? It's a tall order. You have somebody who is seeing only ink squiggles and ink or screen blots before him or her, and they're supposed to simulate real life. Can you do that? Well, it's being done in hypnosis. If anybody ever saw a hypnotist working, it is a real show. Some are fake shows, but it's a real result. You have somebody who is speaking, and through the speech, he's trying to change the input of the human being from external to internal. Among the books I'm going to recommend to you is a book by two professors from US University, Santa Cruz University, called Grinder and Bandler, and they I'm going to provide later on the list of the references. And they, in effect, try to explain how hypnosis works. If you look at the input that a human being gets into his or her mind as a vector of four inputs, you have the visual, the auditory, the salivary, and the tactile. A human being gets all the inputs from the outside. If you use the voice correctly, either written or spoken, eventually all these inputs become internal. If you saw anybody on the stage who thinks he or he is on the beach, all of a sudden there's some beautiful girls walking by there with bikini, and he sees the sun and he feels the sand. All this is internal input generated by the hypnotist's voice. This is what you are aiming at when you are writing fiction. The aim is to induce trance in the reader. How do you do that? There are ways of doing it via technique. The technique used to be known only implicitly by many, many writers. Up to about 10, 15 years ago, people only knew snippets of it. I always wondered why nobody ever taught me all this stuff in creative writing classes. I took writing classes for 2 years, close to 2.5 years, I took a lot of extension programs in Berkeley and Stanford, and then I went for a year and a half, 2 years program in San Francisco State University. And when I asked professors about techniques, nobody knew anything because nothing was known yet, not explicitly. People knew bits and pieces. I mean, you bring a story to a creative writing class and they all tell you if it works, and they feel it works, if it doesn't work. It's as if you're going to Juilliard and they tell you bring back a 4-part concerto, and everybody without knowing scales or contrapunct is going to sit down and see if it works or doesn't. There are rules and there are specific techniques and there are structures. Let's start with what draws the human attention. The human animal is conditioned to pay attention to certain kind of stimuli. Fear causes the human animal to react to movement. So something that moves catches your attention more strongly than something static. So when you describe something, the window was red and the curtain was blue and the sun shone on it, it creates less attraction than you say the redness crept in the window from the left side to the right, and it was overshadowed by the flapping curtain. When you use a verb, when you use movement, you use change, the human animal automatically attracted, either within the sentence or during the entire body of the work, novel, story, whatever. The movement and the change is what attracts the human animal. Tension attracts. It can be either tension in the sentence, tension between the character, conflict, anything static, people don't pay attention to. So if you know what attracts the human animal, you put it in the writing and you attract. The descriptions, as early as, I think, the 19th and early 20th century, Virginia Woolf wrote in The Common Reader that the way to write is to repeat, to recreate the stimuli, the senses as they fall on the human brain. The same kind of order in which you are receiving the senses in a physical sense, if you can recreate them in the sentence, you are going to attract the reader. Hemingway is the first one who has done this almost explicitly. Flaubert has spent half his life to do it in Madame Bovary. Most of the moderns, their technique was to try to recreate the order of perception. So, for example, you can say things like, he or she was looking over the windowsill he was looking over the windowsill into the garden beyond, where the roses grew and overshadowed by the fence, beyond which was the meadow that ended with the hills that over which rose the sky, blue and vast. You go by as if it's a camera eye. The sentence is following the same order in which the eye would follow. This is single sense order of perception. Or if you know the order in which the human body receives sentence, you can imitate that. Biologists have done studies and they show that first of all the human body received size, then height, then width, then color, then depth, then darkness, and so on. If you follow the same order of natural perception in the sentence, you are going to automatically attract the human animal. Up to about 10-15 years ago, nobody ever wrote about such things. Also, very few people wrote about structures of fiction. I'm going to speak now about some of the structures that automatically attract the reader. Some of them may be more technical, some of them will be less. But let us start first of all with the basic. The basic is that you are trying to recreate the world for a special kind of receptor, what I call the meat-based computer. You have something here, and you want to, in effect, play the keyboard on it and make sure that it moves in a certain way. If you have a human being that sits outside and enjoys the sun and feels the lapping of the waves through his toes, and he can drink something and drink the drink, and all this is physical sensation. If you want to capture the reader, you have to capture the same physical sensation. You have to know what creates it. The kind of order in which you describe things usually conforms to a certain format. Let me talk now about structures. First, large structures and then smaller structures, and how you can create attraction by them. It may sound too theoretical, but the people who know more about structures are usually poets. A poet would know that you have difference between Alexandrine verse and tercets, and you have iambic hexameter or iambic heptameter. They know all these things, and they have learned them, and they don't disdain them. When you talk to fiction writers, to prose writers, if you tell them about structures, most of the people who consider themselves artists will disdain it. They will say, no, what I'm writing cannot be put into a form. That's the main topic of my talk. The content and the form are two different things. Practice of exercise and practice is being done on form, not on content. Content is whatever you want to make it, but the forms is what people should practice. Let me give you an example. A very simple exercise for creative writers to begin with is write a half page of action in which all the words are single syllable words. You only have to use single syllable words. Everything else is up to you. You find yourself struggling. It's very difficult to do it. Once you've finished half a page, try to read it, and it has a certain ring to it, but it doesn't sound right. Then you allow yourself one multi-syllable words once a sentence. And then you allow yourself one triple syllable word once a paragraph. You begin to budget them. And what you then realize, and that's a surprise, that when you are working on form, when you're working on structure, without thinking about what you want to say, that's when the subconscious comes into play. Part of the function of working on form is that you don't think about what you want to say, and then it somehow gets transmitted. When you tell students, poetry students, to write a sonnet, 17-line sonnet, or write a haiku, which is a 17-word poem, without knowing what it is, but trying to make it rhyme or not rhyme, a certain structure, what comes out is something that they didn't even think about. You have to cast it into a form. So by casting something into a form, you liberate the subconscious part of your mind, and that's when you really have a chance to catch the reader. Why do you use forms at all? Because some forms are more catchy for the reader. The most basic sort of form is causality. There are 3 or 4 things that attract people without even knowing it attracts them. One is causality. If you say, the queen died, and then the king died, it's sort of a diary. But the queen died, and therefore the king died of grief. It's drama, it's story. Something causes the next. In most sentences, in most stories, if you have causality, you attract the reader. Time sequence. The human animal always looks at time because time is all we have. And if you have something following the other, one thing, because of this, something else happened, and next month something else happened, you have causality, and you have time. You already catch the reader's attention. A simple exercise, it goes something like this. Write a half a page description, story, whatever you want, in which every line you have to do a time movement and a space movement. You don't let yourself dwell on the moment. For beginning writers who only wrote about a little drop of water trembling on the leaf, it's torture. You move, 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 move. You say he got off the sidewalk, and the next hour he was walking around the store, and within 2 hours the policeman came, and then across town something else happened. It took 3 hours, and 2 weeks, and next week later something else happened. And within that time, you move, move, move. Next place, next week, next street. You keep it moving all the time, the reader is attracted. With causality. Because he crossed the street, something else happened. The policeman saw him, and therefore he came, and 2 hours later, his partner heard about him because he called it causality and time and sequence. That's how you get people to at least follow what you're reading. If you do it in an ordinary way, this by itself can cause any text of yours, even a memo, to transfix the reader. If you do it across 60 or 70,000 words, you get a book. The one thing that goes through all books that attract readers is the causal chain. The causal chain is what drive a story forward. You have two enormous forces pressing against each other, and they're what they call in stasis. They can't move. Two things and nothing moves. Then you have initiating event. Something happened. The policeman saw the body of his friend. He has to go and do it. Or Luke Skywalker get a message from beyond the stars. Your father is calling you or something. He has to go and move and do it. Something pushes you, and then he has to go and do something. Because he has to do something, he does it. There's a result, and the result usually is disaster. The disaster causes some internal thinking. He's going to try something else. Again, he's trying, there's a conflict, disaster. This progression of doing something in a scene, rising conflict, a disaster, something called a sequel. You have to rethink it and come with another idea, and another disaster, going down. Now, it's a classical structure of drama. People think it's mechanical, but that's basically how human being gets stuff inside. A baby is trying something, doesn't work, bumps his nose, cries, rethink it, try to do it again. It doesn't, now it falls and breaks. He lies, no, it didn't break. He gets spanked. So he's going to avoid doing some, he's trying and trying and trying, and towards the end, he's faced with something he has to make a major decision about. He either fails or succeeds, and that's the story over. This sort of basic structure, I had people almost come to blows in creative writing courses when they were told they have to cast a novel in the kind of form that most people like to read. They say, I don't care, that's not my story. Well, there's a story and there's a structure of the story, not the same thing. The structure of the story is the way the human brain prefers to get it. What many writers refuse to understand, not anymore, but many, many writers refuse to understand the human brain is a kind of a computer that gets information in a certain kind of language. As if you have a computer that only gets information via COBOL, and you insist on giving information in Algol or in Fortran. I mean, it will not go in. The human brain wants to get information via conflict and sequence and dramatic forms and causality and tension, and if you insist on giving it any other way, the reader won't give you his attention. Now, why is all this important? Let me quote to you some pretty discouraging statistics. 1 in 4 American adults doesn't read any book whatsoever. None. All the others read maybe 6 books a year. In 2007, there have been 270,000 new books published every year. Today it's close to 300,000 new books. If you also add to them books published on demand, plus self-published books, you're going to get 400,000 and 500,000 new books a year. If you want to publish something, you better make sure that what you do will catch the attention of a reader. Because the competition, not just is 500,000 books a year, the competition also is Jay Leno, he's back on TV, and used to be Arsenio Hall, but now he's off, and you have Paris Hilton, and you have television, and you have internet, and you have video games. There's plenty of attention competitors. So if you want to catch the attention of a reader, first of all via an editor, you must make sure that the first thing you aim at when you write is to catch the reader's attention. And when you do that, you always have to remember that the sentence or what you're writing has 2 functions. The first function is to be clear. You have to convey a meaning, convey an idea. It has to be clear. And this you do via grammar, logic, causality, and so on. But the second function is to hypnotize the reader into a trance. And these 2 functions sometimes are opposed to each other. I realize that many editors in the book business, even those who are there for years and years and years, don't know it. They feel something works. They don't know why it works or why it doesn't work. And when you show them there's a conflict, some of them see it, some of them don't even see it. Let me give you an example. When you describe somebody coming close to an orchard, in one of my chapters, there's somebody who's coming close to an orchard. They say he saw the orchard already blossoming. this order, he sees the orchard first as a big blob, and then he comes closer and see it blossoms. Only then he sees the tail. The editor changes to the blossoming orchard. Blossoming orchard is what you call tell rather than show. Orchard already blossoming is basically showing. You create a sentence in the same order as the human animals would see it. In some other languages, it wouldn't be necessary. In French, for example, first you're going to have the forêt, you're going to have florissant afterwards. So if you tell it in French, there's no need to change the order of the sentence. In English you do. But you change it not based on grammar. You change it based on what you want to achieve. You first decide that you want to hypnotize the reader, and then you use grammar any way you can to make sure it happens. These two functions, again, sometimes conflict with each other. So long as you know that the hypnotism or the getting the reader into a trance comes first, then you can start writing fiction. There are many people who write fiction today. Some are talented in an instinctive way. Just like you have somebody who is a Mississippi Delta blues singer who is a natural genius on a one song. He doesn't know scale, he doesn't know how, even notes, but he's a natural teller of the tale, the one tale he has. Usually it's a he. And he's a wonderful singer, but that's the only thing he can do. Just like there are some writers like this. And if you are a genius, then you don't need to hear any of this kind of talk. You go and do whatever you want to do, and it'll last forever. But if you're not a genius, and I'm not, I want to know the rules. And in many cases, the rules are such that we'll enable you to do more than just one song. If you are a blues singer, and you know how the scales work, how they operate, you can start singing other things, you know the principle. Let's try to see how some of these principles operate in fiction. The causality, as I said, works in plot. The long sequence causality. You start with something, the hero is faced with a problem, he does something, goes deeper into the doo-doo, has to make a decision to get out of it, and it gets him deeper and deeper and deeper. You never should take pity on the hero, because if you just extract him, the reader loses interest. You have to get him deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper, and the reader gets more and more attracted. There's a causal chain. If something doesn't work, if there's a sag in the middle, usually the causality stops. If you don't know the need for causality, you are going to look for the flow forever, you'll never find it. The causality can be either internal in the sentence or external in the plot. A conflict has to be there both between the various characters and also between the author and himself or herself. The one thing few people realize is that fiction that tries to be polemical, try to make people better, or try to proselytize, usually dies. An artist is someone who sees art as the ultimate value. Not because it is, but because that's the way he or she is. Art über alles, if I may say so. You have artists like Sholokhov in Russia, who wrote Quiet Flows the Dawn. He tried to put Natasha on the tractor because it was useful. Margaret Atwood, in some of the first stories, tried to put Canadian Natasha on the feminist tractor. I mean, it's a different color, but she's still a tractorist. If you're trying to do with your fiction or with your art something which you think more exalted than art, it will come right through. Now, this basically gives you a way of writing something that will attract the reader if you write against your own grain. If you are left-wing, write a story in which a right-winger basically triumphs. If you are a right-winger, find a story in which a right-winger sees himself wrong. If you are really a devout Catholic, write a story in which a Catholic loses his faith. But seriously, if you are a Jew, write a story in which a Jew is shown to be contemptible, which was what Philip Roth has done, and so on. Elie Wiesel, on the other hand, a Nobel Prize winner, wrote a story in which he's trying to prove that all the Jews are wonderful, and the stories are sort of not interesting. It's not because one is true and one is not true. But if a writer writes against his or his own grain, he's going to agitate himself so much that this agitation is what will move him and also move the reader. But they're just a raw material. It's just part of conflict. Once you have this conflict, you have to structure it. I already mentioned timeline. In any kind of story, if you have a timeline, it will draw the reader. You don't have to present the timeline in the order in which the story is written. A French-Belgian author, Mariette Yourcenar, wrote some wonderful story in which she starts from the end, goes in the middle, then flashes back to the beginning, and then goes back to what happened after the end, but she tells you exactly which part is located. So the story is still presented in the order in which things happen, even the presentation is sort of hyper-modern. So long as the reader knows where you are, and there's conflict, and there's a timeline, and there's movement, biologically you'll be attracted. And if you also write against your own grain, proving yourself wrong rather than right, usually you will cry when you write, and the reader will take an interest in this. As far as the tension or the conflict goes, there are some basic rules that have been known in Hollywood for years and years and years. A scene is only a scene if there's a conflict in it. If there's no conflict, it's not a scene. Summarize it. It's well known. And you'll be surprised how many books you pick up and you see dialogues in which people basically tell stories, an exposition. They give you the information. Information should never be given in a dialogue or a trialogue or any kind of a scene. You summarize it. He and his mother fought for 3 hours, throwing objects at each other. Finally, he took his shoe and threw it at the wall and said, "I hate you." The "I hate you" comes in quote. All the rest is summarized. Unless it's a real conflict, you summarize it. You don't waste time because the reader will disappear. The reader doesn't have to be there. The conflict itself has to rise. Static conflict sounds good, but it's after a while you lose the reader. There has to be change. The one who know it most of all, oddly enough, are filmmakers. There's a recent good book by David Mamet about making films, and he shows how you can make the scene go fast by having one scene, another scene, and he said the movie is in the cut, from one to the other. That's one way. There's a book called Making Movies, and I'm going to give the list later on to those who want it. And in it, the director, famous director, Sidney Lumet, shows how a gentle change to all the movie will attract the reader. You start with a very grainy filter, and you get the sharper filter, and a sharper filter. Towards the end, a very sharp filter. The reader, the audience, subliminally will feel the change and become tenser and tenser and tenser. You're going to raise emotion in there. Or in 12 Angry Men, they start by having a very long shot, and then as the movie progresses, you get shorter and shorter and shorter until in the very key scenes you see a very close-up. And then, once the conflict is resolved, you have another very long shot from above. These are all technical means, but the changes are gradual. In a book, when you start the action going, you can have in the background the heat is rising in the city. It's starting by being very mildly hot, then you have something coming. And the heat begins to rise, and the heat rising and rising and rising. You can have one sentence per chapter. The heat rose even more. Temperature got 30 degrees, and 40 degrees, and 50 degrees. And before the peak before the climax, you have like 50 degrees. They're all sweating, and then the resolution towards the end of it, the temperature cools. If you lead the reader through gradual movement, physically, he's going to be attracted. So if you use the language as a hypnotic mean, and use the same mechanism that a hypnotist uses, you are going to have the reader basically sitting there in a trance, and then you can put into his or her mouth whatever you want. I don't care what you put in there, so long as the reader is in a trance, he can't put the book down, and once you put it down, he can't forget it. The mechanical tricks that one has to learn are quite numerous. And the best way to learn them, in essence, is by doing exercises. I mentioned exposition. Before I go to the exercises, exposition is all the details you have to provide. If you pick up any of the older novels, like Tom Jones, or any of the novels came after that, you can see something like Lord Stanley Richards came into the room. He was born in the city of Bath in the year 1902. His mother was such and such. You take basically a 2-page timeout and you tell everything about him. The reader will stand for this nonsense because he has no television and no internet and nobody calls him out to supper. But it's a bad way of doing it, not just because the reader will disappear, but because you are missing using the information as ammunition. You bring the information only when it can do some good in the scene itself. There are some basic old rules in Hollywood of the 20s. For example, one rule used to say, break it up and under heat. And it sounds crazy, but if you have a cowboy that wants to tell the other one that he hated his father, he just to say, I hate my father. Okay, fine. He's shooting against the bad guy. The bad guy shooting back and says, just sit down, they're going to shoot you. I don't care because my father was born there, I'm going to shoot him. But because I hate my father, bang. If it comes to action, that the action itself gives you something else to watch, things become more tense. It's a very primitive way. There are other ways of doing it. The interesting thing is that even good books who are written in a not modern way last less and they make less of an impact. I'll mention two or three, mention some more techniques, and then I'll give you some of the exercises, and I'll stop, ask for questions. Anybody here read Brideshead Revisited? Okay, Evelyn Waugh is a much underappreciated writer. His technique is fantastic. Some of the Brits have wonderful technique. And Evelyn Waugh wrote a book called Brideshead Revisited. It's a maudlin, schlocky book. The characters are stock. There's some sort of a lost domain, and you have some lords, and they're all going to lose their old way of life. The book reverberates because in one page you can have 3 or 4 points of view. One character tells another character what they think about that character, while the 4th character is listening and reports to the 5th one. So not only you are getting the information, but you're getting the impact of it on 2 characters, plus what will happen later on. Using the information as sort of a revealing medium. There's another book about a similar topic called The Lost Domain in English. It's basically Le Grand Monde, Alain Fournier. It's a much better book, in my opinion, than many of others, but it's not as well remembered today. Nobody will make a movie out of it, nobody will do much with it, but it's a small masterpiece. Few read it because it is not as attractive for the human biology as Evelyn Waugh. Evelyn Waugh has in his book, Decline and Fall, and he wrote it when he was 23. It took him 35 days to write it. One long noodle of writing in his aunt's gazebo. I mean, I hate the guy. He wrote it, and it's fantastic. The first version has to be suppressed because there is some sort of shady sexual shenanigans happening. But the book is wonderful. There's one character that basically appears in 5 points. The little old Clutterbuck. You hear him whistle hideously in one scene, then he's shot in the foot, then you hear that his leg became black, and then his leg is amputated, and finally he dies. That's the character, and you see him before your eyes. It's like this sea snake that you see. There's a coil here, nothing, another coil here, another coil 5 miles away, another coil over there. It's an enormous sea snake. You don't know how to describe everything, but if you do things in pieces, and you keep the pieces in your mind and you control them, you control the reader. How can you learn to do all this stuff? Well, as I said, in the past, writers used to do this for years and years and years, and learn a little bit and get from somebody else, and get comments from others, and get editors. There was nothing really orderly. For the last 10 or 15 years, there's been an avalanche of books by people who know techniques, and they begin to write it. And there are some books of technique which I think should be on the shelf of every writer. And in effect today, for $250 or $300 with an order from Amazon, you can get books that if you read them and you do the exercises, you are going to have technique that few other people had 20 and 30 years ago. One of these books, one of the early ones, is called What If? It was written by 2 professors from Harvard. It basically gave writing exercises for fiction writers. Very simple stuff, like write a description of the sky by somebody who is an escaped convict who murdered 2 people the night before, and he's afraid of being caught. Don't say anything about the convict, don't say about the murder, just describe the night sky and let the reader understand who is the one who's talking. Now take the same convict and make him 30 years older. Rewrite the page. What will change? Then write the same thing, not in first point of view, but the third person point of view. Then do it third person close, which means short psychological distance. Then do it in a way that somebody tells about him. Then read the same thing in unreliable narration. You basically take the same sort of piece of dough and you twist, change to show you that writing is not autobiography, not therapy. It's a profession. Or write first sentence of a story or a book that will capture the reader and capture you. And then do another one, and another, and another. For example, when I was 5 years old, our maid shaved my head completely without telling anybody, and afterward made me lie and said I did it. That's how the story begins. It captured my interest and your interest as a reader. Now, when I was 12 years old, my maid shaved my head and made me tell it wasn't her but me. When I was 25 years old, or the same thing told by a man, told by a woman, told by twins. Twist, change. In science you sometimes change one parameter to see what else will change. You can do the same thing in fiction to teach yourself how to manipulate little things. You change it by variable, change adjective. You do an exercise of conflict. You draw a line and the conflict looked like this. Now have the conflict look like this. Now have the same kind of line like this. Redo the conflict, it will be like this. How? What? You do it. You begin to get the idea of form. Let me give you some names of books. Anybody will give me an email later. I'm going to send him the list of the books. But some of them are just absolutely necessary. There's a book called How to Write a Damn Good Novel. That is the grandfather of almost all plot writers in the US. It's quite simplistic, but it's effective. Written by a guy called Jim Fry, F-R-E-Y. And he was a professor of mine in Berkeley. And he gives you the techniques. There's another guy called Beckham, who does something in a bit more sophisticated way. Also, give you how to do plotting. And Beckham also had a book about setting, how to use a setting that will, in effect, influence all the book. There are books about character. There are some books that give you all the elements of writing. I have a list here of 15 or 16 books. Any of these books, if you take them and do the exercises, every day, half an hour, in the morning, half an hour, 45 minutes, and you keep the booklet and you keep the exercises, before you even start writing, I assume some of you do write, you cannot avoid getting better. Yehudi Menuhin does an hour or two of etudes before he starts playing. Any of the ballet dancers used to do about an hour of limbering up before they start doing the ballet dances. A gymnast stretches before they start doing the gymnastics. Anybody who is a performer, who is an artist, has to start by doing the basics. If you're playing violin, you do first to second, first to third flageolet, first to second, first to third flageolet. You practice the basics. Most writers don't even know the basics exist. The basics exist. They're out there in books. Amazon will sell them to you. Buy them, practice them daily, and then you can start getting published. Because, for me, the only criteria for a writer is very simple. You have to get published. You haven't gotten published, you're not a writer yet. To get published, you have to attract the reader's attention, mechanically if you can, any other way if you cannot, because the first one to attract is an agent, and the editor, and then a reader. If you do that, you get published, you get the ultimate writer's reward. 100 years from now, when my voice already is gone, somebody in the library is going to take up a book and open it up, and my voice will speak. That's it. I'm finished.